Some houses whisper, even after everyone has left. And some truths wait patiently, hidden in ivy and silence, until someone listens closely enough to hear them. Tonight's story is one of quiet devotion, buried secrets, and the kind of mystery that lingers in the air long after the last page is turned. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. Jessica Fletcher set the letter down on her kitchen table and reached for her glasses. The envelope was thick, the paper a creamy ivory, and the handwriting unmistakably elegant, arching loops and a deliberate slant, as if time itself had learned to write in cursive. Gwendolen Brackenridge, the signature read. It had been more than 30 years. The name conjured images of rose gardens behind dormitory walls, whispered Latin phrases in crowded libraries, and the echo of laughter carried on ivy-draped walks. Gwendolen had always carried a certain gravity, as though she'd been born with secrets stitched into her hemline. Jessica unfolded the letter. "Dearest Jessica, I hope this finds you well. I write not only in fondness but in some urgency. I am hosting a small gathering at Bramblewood Hall, family, a few old friends, and those I trust to see beyond appearances. I would be deeply grateful if you would come. With affection, Gwendolen." Jessica read it twice. The wording was charming, but something in its rhythm was off, too formal for an old friend, too veiled for an invitation. There was something unsaid in the spaces between the lines. She sipped her tea and glanced out the window at Cabot Cove's late autumn mist. Then she folded the letter neatly and placed it beside her notebook. Whatever awaited her at Bramblewood Hall, it would not be a simple reunion. The countryside rolled out in velvet tones as Jessica's taxi wound its way through narrow lanes. Mist threaded through hedgerows and curled around mossy trees like memory refusing to let go. And then, as if rising from the earth itself, stood Bramblewood Hall, stone-grey, vine-wrapped, and defiantly elegant against the passing of time. The driver hesitated at the iron gate. "They don't get many visitors out this way," he said, eyes flicking to the towering house. Jessica simply smiled. "That's what makes the invitation all the more curious." Inside the main hall, the scent of wood smoke mingled with something floral and older, lavender and parchment, perhaps. Gwendolen greeted her with open arms and a perfumed cheek. She hadn't changed much, still stately, still wearing pearls like armor. "You've come," she whispered, with something that resembled both relief and calculation. Jessica gave a gracious nod. When an old friend writes by hand, one ought to listen. She was shown to a guest room overlooking the overgrown orchard. The wallpaper was faded but dignified, and the window panes sighed with the wind. As her suitcase was placed at the foot of the bed, Jessica glanced down the hallway, past oil paintings and ancestral silence, and sensed it. That subtle tension, the hush that wasn't peace. There were voices below, familiar laughter coated in formality, and footsteps that paused just a beat too long at the top of the stairs. Jessica set down her bag and pulled out her notebook. "Not all invitations arrive without expectations," she wrote. Dinner that evening was a study in understatement. The long mahogany table gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Gwendolen presided at its head with all the grace of faded aristocracy. Beside her sat a young woman with sharp posture and sharper eyes, Beatrix Langley, introduced as the estate manager. Her smile was pleasant, but her presence felt rehearsed, like a role learned from too many rehearsals. Opposite Beatrix sat Andrew Brackenridge, Gwendolen's son. His manner was brisk, almost irritated, as if the silverware offended him. Jessica noted his frequent glances at his mother and the barely concealed tension in his jaw. He drank more than he ate. To Jessica's left was Celia, Gwendolen's niece. A soft-spoken artist with ink-stained fingertips, she seemed uneasy in the candlelight, as if too many eyes made her blur at the edges. And at the far end, awkward and half-forgotten, sat Miles Fenton, the visiting art historian. He muttered compliments on the portraits, dabbed nervously at his collar and avoided prolonged eye contact with anyone. Conversation fluttered like moths around old tapestries, safe, brittle, and fading. Yet Jessica noticed the undercurrents. Beatrix watched Gwendolen too closely, Andrew drank too quickly, and Celia offered no reason for her visible discomfort. There was a story beneath the tablecloth, folded and pressed like silver napkins. Afterward, as the guests dispersed and the grandfather clock chimed distantly, Jessica lingered by a faded portrait near the stairs. A woman in 19th-century dress looked back with a half-smile, serene but shadowed. "Quite a group," Jessica murmured to herself. The painting offered no reply. The next morning brought a hush over Bramblewood, thick with dew, layered in the scent of wet stone and fallen leaves. Jessica wandered the east corridor, drawn by the quiet hum of old architecture and the pull of curiosity. There, opposite the window where ivy curled like fingers seeking sunlight, she saw it, a long vertical crack down the hallway mirror, jagged and thin, almost elegant in its imperfection. Jessica paused. Mirrors in old houses often carried more than reflections. Sometimes they held the fractures of the past. She descended into the garden after breakfast. The sundial, centered in a small circle of hedges, was chipped at the edge, its gnomon snapped and weathered. Time itself seemed arrested, or worse, disregarded. She ran her fingers along the cold brass and wondered how many secrets had passed through this garden unseen. Returning inside, she found Beatrix giving instructions to a groundskeeper with a tone far more authoritative than deferential. Jessica made a small mental note. There was something in Bramblewood's quiet that wasn't restful. It was the quiet of rehearsed silences, of conversations that ended just before the truth was spoken. Later that afternoon, while setting aside her coat in the foyer, Jessica noticed the guest book, a thick, leather-bound volume resting on a polished walnut stand. The ink was fresh in recent entries, but she turned back several pages, curiosity guiding her fingertips. Tucked just between two sheets was something out of place, a black-and-white photograph, time-worn and curling at the corners. It showed a group of staff lined up beneath Bramblewood's portico, dated perhaps from the late 1950s. Their postures were formal, but their expressions varied, some proud, some tired, one or two quietly smiling. Jessica's eyes scanned the image twice before her breath caught. One face, third from the left, had been scratched out. Not torn, not faded, deliberately removed, the paper frayed beneath the mark of some sharp tool. She turned the photograph over. There was no name, no date. Just a faint smudge of ink where someone had once started to write and stopped. Why would such a photograph be hidden and defaced? And why placed here amid welcome pages and polite greetings? Jessica slid the photograph back between the pages, now more carefully than before. She closed the guest book gently. Some absences speak more loudly than any signature. The dining room of Bramblewood Hall shimmered with soft candlelight, and yet the air hung thick with unease. Jessica sat 2 seats from Gwendolen, whose posture remained impeccable despite the clear weariness in her eyes. The silver gleamed, the soup was delicate, and the wine, French and fragrant, flowed easily. Still the mood resisted comfort. "Before dessert," Gwendolen said, her spoon resting quietly in her bowl, "I should tell you all something. I've been giving thought to my affairs, to the future of Bramblewood." Andrew's fork paused mid-air. "You mean the will?" he said, tone clipped. "Again." Beatrix, seated beside Gwendolen, shifted in her seat, but kept her expression smooth. Her hand gently touched the edge of Gwendolen's armrest. Too intimate for a manager, too casual for a friend. "I've come to realize," Gwendolen continued, "that legacy isn't simply about land and stone, it's about truth and whom we entrust it to." Celia's wineglass tilted slightly in her hand. Her knuckles were white. Andrew exhaled a sharp breath. "So you're disinheriting me in favor of strangers?" Jessica noted the way Gwendolen didn't immediately refute the charge. Instead, She looked toward her untouched dessert plate, voice quieter than before. "I'm making changes, that's all." Silence followed, broken only by the grandfather clock ticking solemnly behind them. Jessica, watching the table, did not miss the glance Beatrix exchanged with a man seated 3 places away, an estate solicitor whose presence had been casually explained earlier as help with archives. Nor did she miss Celia's hands, trembling as she excused herself before dessert. The candles flickered. Somewhere outside, the wind sighed through the ivy. Jessica had attended many dinners like this in her life, tables of wealth, history, and buried tension. But rarely had the bitterness been so elegantly presented. After dinner, the guests dispersed like actors exiting a poorly rehearsed play. Jessica wandered to the conservatory, drawn by the faint scent of geraniums and the rhythmic clicking of Beatrix's heels on the stone floor. Gwendolen stood by the glass doors, arms crossed, gaze lost in the moonlit garden. Beatrix lingered just behind her, speaking in low tones that didn't quite carry. Jessica couldn't hear the words, but she saw the closeness. The way Beatrix leaned in without hesitation, the way Gwendolen didn't pull away. That was not estate management, that was familiarity. "Beatrix," Gwendolen said softly, "we'll talk about it later, not tonight." Beatrix's smile flickered and held. In the hallway, Jessica passed Celia emerging from the library. The young woman looked startled to see her, clutching something in her hand, a silver locket perhaps, and quickly tucked it into her sleeve. "Oh," Celia said, attempting composure, "just getting some air." Her voice trembled. The scent of liquor clung faintly to her scarf. Jessica offered a gentle nod, saying nothing, but her gaze lingered just a moment too long. Later, as Jessica retired to her room, she passed Andrew seated alone in the drawing room, brooding over a nearly empty glass. His jaw worked wordlessly, and he barely acknowledged her presence. Jessica entered her room quietly, her thoughts already layering themselves in order. One by one, the pieces were beginning to show their edges, but it wasn't yet a picture. Not yet. The stillness of the night was broken by a scream, sharp, feminine, and unmistakably real. Jessica sat upright in bed, her heart racing with that peculiar clarity she had known too many times before. She reached for her robe, slipping into her slippers with practiced calm, and followed the sound down the corridor, past the cracked mirror, down the stairs. The household was already stirring. Celia stood at the foot of the staircase, pale and shaking, her hand to her mouth. Andrew emerged from the study, eyes wide, a crystal tumbler still in his hand. Miles lingered near the far wall, speechless. At the base of the great staircase, in a tangle of silk and pearl, lay Gwendolen. Beatrix dropped to her knees beside the still figure, whispering her name. Gwendolen. Jessica moved with quiet certainty. She took in the details, the unnatural position of the neck, the twisted hem of the dress, the glint of something in Gwendolen's clenched hand. A bracelet? Tarnished, old. Her eyes rose to the top of the staircase. The rug was askew. A porcelain figurine had shattered beside it, its shards catching the low light like scattered clues. There were too many details for an accident. Too many silences that suddenly had shape. Jessica stood still, listening to the hush descend once more. But this was no longer the quiet of secrets. It was the hush that follows a violent truth. Jessica stood apart as the others gathered, voices low and brittle. Beatrix wept in earnest now, held lightly by the housekeeper, while Andrew looked hollowed, his arms folded tightly over his chest. Celia stood in a corner, hands shaking, whispering, "I didn't hear her. I thought I heard, but I didn't know." Jessica moved quietly up the staircase. The rug near the top landing was slightly rucked, its edge folded under in a way that invited misstep. But it wasn't the kind of disorder age created. No, this had been manipulated. A corner pulled, perhaps, or shifted, just so. She knelt, careful not to touch, and glanced to the wall where the shattered porcelain had lain. A pale patch of dust marked its usual place. It had fallen too, perhaps during the fall. But something didn't sit right. The piece had not simply slipped. It had been dislodged. Back at the base of the stairs, Jessica crouched near Gwendolyn's body once more, peering at the bracelet still cradled in her stiff fingers. Silver, worn. Not the kind Gwendolyn typically wore. A family heirloom, or something else entirely? She made a note in her mind of the clasp, broken, not fastened. The inspector would arrive soon, and he would ask his questions. But Jessica already had one of her own. If Gwendolyn had fallen, why had her hand closed around something first? It was not the chaos of panic. It was the last act of someone with a message to send. Inspector Barrow arrived not long after dawn, brisk and officious, with a rain-dark coat and a brow already furrowed. He listened to the accounts with polite detachment, taking notes with a pencil that never seemed to pause. Accidental fall, most likely, he said, glancing toward the staircase. Old carpet, slippery soles, a fragile woman, shaken by family stress. That will do. Jessica watched him for a moment before speaking gently. She was holding something, she said. A bracelet that didn't belong to her. And the carpet, someone had folded the edge under. Barrow offered a half smile, the kind professionals use to humour polite but meddlesome guests. With all due respect, Mrs. Fletcher, I've walked on worse in my aunt's farmhouse. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right one. Sometimes, Jessica replied evenly, but not often in a house like this. Barrow made no reply, but Jessica saw the flicker of interest behind his eyes. He was listening, just not ready to say so. Jessica turned to the window where the morning fog still clung to the garden stones. A death in the night, a scream, a staged fall, and a bracelet, like a whisper, clenched in a dying hand. No, this was not a simple accident. Gwendolyn Brackenridge had been trying to protect something, or someone, and now whatever she'd left behind had become a message Jessica intended to read. The silence of Bramblewood was shifting, and beneath it, something was beginning to speak. Morning came slowly at Bramblewood Hall, filtered through the weight of what had happened. Gwendolyn's absence was most felt in the stillness of the breakfast room. Her chair, conspicuously empty, seemed to cast its own silence across the table. Jessica took her tea and wandered toward the servants' wing, guided more by instinct than intention. Mrs. Elkins, the housekeeper, was polishing the brass knobs of the sideboard with practiced rhythm when Jessica entered. "You've been with the Brackenridge family a long time," Jessica said softly. Mrs. Elkins looked up, her eyes sharp, but not unkind. 36 years this winter," she replied. "Lady Gwendolyn and I, we understood each other." Jessica nodded. "That sort of trust doesn't come easily." The housekeeper's hands slowed, then stilled. "She didn't fall, Mrs. Fletcher," she said quietly. "Not without help. That stair, she would have held the railing." "Always did." Jessica met her gaze. "Did you notice anything unusual yesterday? Before dinner?" A pause, then. "She argued with Miss Celia. I heard them in the study, raised voices, about a letter, I believe. Lady Gwendolyn said something about destroying it. Miss Celia begged her not to." Jessica absorbed this without comment. "What kind of letter?" she asked gently. Mrs. Elkins shook her head. "Didn't hear that part. Only that it wasn't meant to see light again." A gust of wind stirred the lace curtain behind them. Dust caught the sun like tiny stars. "Miss Celia's a good girl," Elkins added after a moment, "but she carries more than she lets on." Jessica inclined her head. "We all do in places like this." As she made her way back down the hall, Jessica's mind turned over the idea, a letter that Gwendolyn wanted destroyed, a niece pleading for its preservation, and somewhere in that gap between fire and forgiveness was motive. The study smelled faintly of tobacco and lavender, two scents Jessica now forever associated with Gwendolyn's presence. No one had yet touched the room. A velvet cushion still bore the impression of where she had last sat. Jessica approached the writing desk, its surface cluttered with correspondence, pens, and the weight of unspoken things. She sifted gently through the letters, noting the deliberate order, bills, invitations. A gardening magazine opened to a feature on winter roses, but then, near the back of the top drawer, something caught her attention, a half-burned envelope. The paper was scorched at the edges but not destroyed, tucked hastily into the drawer as though someone had started a fire and changed their mind. The seal, a faded red wax circle, bore the crest of Bramblewood. The letter inside had been partially consumed, but Jessica could just make out the looping script in Gwendolyn's handwriting. "I never meant to lie, but I had to protect." The rest was lost to ash. Beside the envelope lay a folded sketch. Jessica opened it carefully. It was a rough but recognizably skilled pencil drawing of Bramblewood Hall, as it might have appeared half a century ago. The paper was old, the graphite faded, but near the bottom edge, just beneath a cluster of oak trees, a name was written in fine, deliberate print: Harriet. Jessica's mind stilled. That name again, first scratched out in a photo, now written with care on a sketch hidden in the desk of a woman about to change her will. The door creaked behind her. Jessica turned, but no one entered. She returned the drawing to the envelope and made a mental note to ask about Bramblewood's residence in 1957. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about memory, and something someone had worked very hard to forget. Jessica found Miles Fenton in the West Gallery, standing quietly in front of a partially covered painting. He held a soft brush in one hand and appeared to be lost in thought, though whether it was the artwork or something deeper, Jessica wasn't sure. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said gently. He turned, startled. "Not at all, Mrs. Fletcher. I'm only trying to decide whether the overpainting was deliberate or just the result of a very bad restoration attempt." Jessica glanced at the canvas. It depicted a pastoral scene, a picnic in the garden, figures blurred with time. "Has something been removed?" "Concealed, more like," Miles murmured. "See this section here?" He motioned to the edge of the frame. "The pigment is newer, not even 10 years old. It's hiding something underneath. And this," he pointed to the lower corner, "was chipped recently. The frame was forced open, I believe." Jessica took a slow breath. "Were any other paintings tampered with?" "Yes, a few from the side corridor were removed last month. Beatrix told me they were being cleaned, but I've only received 2 of the 5 back, and one of them wasn't the original." Jessica tilted her head. "A forgery?" Miles nodded but hesitated. "A well-done one, but yes, it's not Bramblewood's." There was a hesitation in his voice, one that tugged at Jessica's ear. "And the painting beneath this one? Do you know what it shows?" He looked almost embarrassed. "I think it's a portrait, possibly of 2 women from the 1950s. One might be Gwendolyn." Jessica's thoughts immediately returned to the sketch and the name written there. "Harriet?" she asked softly. Miles blinked. "Yes, how did you—" But Jessica didn't answer. Her mind was already fitting the pieces together. Not every forgery was about money. Some were about hiding the truth. Jessica lingered beside the painting as Miles excused himself to check on a canvas stored in the east alcove. The soft afternoon light caught the edge of the chipped frame, gold leaf flaking like dried petals. She reached out, tracing the jagged line where the frame had splintered. A crack, that clean, didn't happen with age. She turned her attention to the canvas itself. The layers of paint were subtle, but irregular. The brushwork in the lower third felt rushed, masking rather than composing. There was something buried here, not just artistically, but intentionally. Jessica tilted her head, quietly reflecting. Why conceal a portrait in plain sight, unless what it showed was more dangerous than a forgery? She reached for her notebook and scribbled a short line. Repetition of Harriet. Photo, sketch, now portrait. The name had surfaced too many times now to be coincidence. And then there was the style, the original layer just visible beneath the cracking varnish. The figure's outline was tender, the pose intimate. Whoever painted it had not been distant from their subject. Jessica stepped back. There was love in that first image, love, and perhaps regret. The footsteps returning down the hallway startled her from her thoughts. She smiled lightly as Miles reappeared with a wrapped canvas under his arm. "Tell me," she said, "have you ever found something in a painting that was meant to stay hidden?" He hesitated. "Often enough to know it's rarely about art." Jessica nodded. It was about people, and the truths they buried in silence and paint. That evening, Jessica returned to the library. The great house had grown quieter since Gwendolyn's death, but its hush was different now, not solemn exactly, but anticipatory, as if the walls, long forced to keep secrets, had sensed the moment of confession approaching. Jessica moved slowly between the tall shelves. The fireplace was cold, the logs untouched since the night before. The faint scent of ash still lingered, a hint perhaps of a fire never quite allowed to burn what it intended. She stood near the west wall. The bookcases there were oddly spaced, one shelf slightly deeper than the others. Jessica's fingers brushed along the edges, remembering what Gwendolyn once told her, decades ago. True legacies are kept close, but never too obvious. She knelt by the bottom shelf and pushed gently. There was a soft click. The panel swung inward, revealing a narrow steel door, an old wall safe. The dial was faded but functional, and faint scratch marks suggested it had been used recently. Jessica didn't attempt to open it. She had no key, no code, but the very existence of the safe, hidden behind curated shelves, was telling. Gwendolyn had come here. Likely just before the dinner or even during it. Someone had seen her, or heard her, or followed. She stepped back and scanned the room. A decanter sat half empty near the armchair. A notepad lay face down on the writing desk, no words, just the impression of writing, visible only when held to the light. Jessica tilted it and read the faint indentations. "Not now. After dinner. You'll understand when you read it." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting, she recognized it. Beatrix. So Gwendolyn had left instructions, something intended to be revealed. Or perhaps protected. Jessica sat in the armchair, her gaze drifting to the velvet curtains and the tall window just beyond. A soft rustling stirred in the garden, ivy perhaps, or something more restless. If Gwendolyn had placed something in that safe, a letter, a deed, a confession, then it was either still there or it had been taken before her death. And if it had been taken? The motive shifted. This wasn't only about inheritance, it was about a secret someone needed to erase, permanently. Jessica folded her notes with care and returned them to her pocket. Her footsteps were quiet as she left the library, but her mind was already alight with questions. She had the painting, the sketch, the missing documents, and now a safe. All the pieces were here, but the story hadn't yet told her who was willing to kill to end it. Jessica closed the library door behind her softly. The corridor felt emptier in Gwendolyn's absence, as though her presence had once anchored the house against its own secrets. She found Andrew seated in the morning room, nursing what looked to be his second drink before noon. The decanter on the sideboard had lost considerable volume since the night before. "Mind if I join you?" Jessica asked gently. He glanced up with a shrug. "I don't suppose it matters now, does it?" Jessica sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, merely laden. "I heard you had words with your mother before dinner," she said quietly. Andrew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Everyone always assumes the worst with me. I suppose I make it easy." "She was planning to change her will," Jessica said. He didn't deny it. Instead, his eyes fixed on the fireplace as though hoping for an answer from the embers. "She was going to leave it all to strangers," he muttered. "The house, the land, the family name, Everything our father preserved. Jessica watched him carefully. And the money? He flinched slightly. That's gone, or near enough. I borrowed against the trust years ago. She covered more than she ever admitted. But this place, Bramblewood, was supposed to be mine. His voice wasn't angry. It was hollow, resigned. You were seen in the library the night she died, Jessica said softly. He looked at her, startled. I wasn't there to hurt her. I was looking for the safe. I knew about it, barely. I thought maybe she'd hidden something, a new will maybe, something I could use. Jessica studied him. There was a desperation in his words, but not the violent kind, the kind born of fear, not hatred. Did you find anything? No, he said bitterly. Just empty shelves. I left before midnight. Jessica believed him, but the safe had been opened by someone. And desperation, even if not criminal, still left footprints worth following. The soft sound of a drawer closing caught Jessica's attention as she walked past the east hallway. She paused, listening. Another faint rustle. It was Gwendolyn's bedroom. Jessica tapped lightly on the door. Celia? No answer. She stepped inside. Celia stood beside the writing bureau, startled, her fingers frozen around a velvet-lined jewelry box. Her eyes widened, guilt flashing across her face like a guilty child caught near the cookie tin. I was just looking for a locket, she said quickly, too quickly. It's all I wanted. Aunt Gwen wore it every Sunday. Jessica's gaze lowered to the object in Celia's hand, a compact mirror, ornate and old-fashioned. But it was open. And inside, nestled beside the powder puff, was something glinting faintly in the light, a small brass key. Celia followed Jessica's gaze, her expression shifting from startled to defensive. I didn't steal it, she said. I didn't know where else to look. She kept things. Old letters. I thought, maybe something about my mother. Jessica nodded slowly, her tone gentle. And this key? I found it taped inside a drawer. She held it out reluctantly. I don't know what it opens. Jessica accepted it carefully. The shape was familiar, similar to those used in traditional wall safes. It might open something important, Jessica said, and I think you do know that. Celia lowered her eyes. She told me not to ask questions, that some things were too old to matter, but they did matter to her. Jessica regarded her a moment longer, her thoughts already spinning. 2 keys to the same mystery, and perhaps 2 very different reasons for wanting it kept hidden. Later that afternoon, Jessica walked the estate garden path, tracing the slow arc of the gravel beneath her shoes, the ivy climbing the outer walls like a green whisper. Her steps brought her toward the east conservatory, quiet, unused, except for a flicker of movement inside. She slowed. Behind the glass, Beatrix stood near a tall man in a tailored coat. They were speaking low, too far to hear, but the body language was unmistakable. Beatrix's posture was rigid, her hands clasped tightly. The man, Jessica recognized him now, was not from the household staff. It was Mr. Pierce, a solicitor Gwendolyn had consulted years ago regarding the estate's museum accreditation. The conversation grew more animated. Beatrix gestured sharply. Pierce, surprisingly composed, handed her a document, folded and bound. She took it quickly, slipped it into her bag, and said something final before walking toward the opposite door. Jessica waited. Moments later, Beatrix emerged from the far side, her face composed, but not serene. Jessica caught the faint line between her brows. Tension, perhaps worry. She didn't see Jessica, not yet. Later that evening, Jessica found the courage to raise the topic, casually, over tea in the drawing room. You seem to know Mr. Pierce well, she remarked. Beatrix's cup paused. He's handled estate filings, minor things. Jessica offered a mild smile. He's also an executor, if I'm not mistaken. Beatrix didn't answer, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. There were always answers in what people chose not to say. Jessica leaned back, her mind already stitching the fabric of motive, opportunity, and quiet inheritance. If Gwendolen had changed her will, and if Beatrix had known, it might not be desperation that killed. It might be prevention. Jessica returned to the gallery just before dusk. The day's light, now golden and slanting, gave the room a softness that made the portraits appear to breathe. Miles was bent over the easel, his brush hovering with the kind of reverence reserved for history, real or imagined. She cleared her throat gently. "You said you believed the portrait underneath was of Gwendolen?" Miles nodded, his expression unusually serious. "The underpainting is distinct, done in a different hand, possibly Gwendolen's father. But what's fascinating is the second figure." He stepped aside. Jessica leaned in. Where once there had been a vague garden landscape, there now emerged the suggestion of two women, arms loosely entwined, Bramblewood's tower rising faintly in the background. The faces were still partially obscured by decades of varnish and the remains of the cover layer, but the figure on the left was unmistakable. Gwendolen, perhaps in her early 20s, her expression serene. The other woman, her features only just beginning to take shape, had been painted with equal care. Jessica's gaze lingered. "Do you have any idea who she was?" she asked. Miles hesitated, then offered a folded note he had found taped to the back of the frame. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the message was clear. "To live quietly is to love in silence. H. 1959. Jessica held the note delicately. The single initial matched the name she'd encountered now 3 times, Harriet. So it hadn't just been a name in a sketch or a figure in an old photograph. This was something deeply personal, and it had been hidden, not erased, but protected. Jessica felt a quiet pang in her chest, the ache of unspoken truths kept too long. Whoever Harriet was, she hadn't been incidental. She had been central. And perhaps, to someone in this house, she still was. Jessica sat alone in the gallery for several minutes after Miles departed, the silence around her now infused with presence. That image, Gwendolen and Harriet, entwined in a garden not unlike the one outside, was more than sentiment. It was declaration, once buried beneath layers of discretion and dust. And now, it was a key. She reached for her notebook, turning back through pages filled with sketches of memory. The half-burned letter, the sketch marked Harriet, the scratched-out face in the photograph, the compact key, the tampered stare. Each clue by itself was intriguing, but together they wove something deeper. This wasn't about property or money, this was about preservation and fear. Jessica recalled something Gwendolen once told her years ago at a reunion. Love and legacy rarely speak the same language. Perhaps now she understood what her friend had meant. If Gwendolen had intended to reveal her relationship with Harriet, or even revise her will to reflect it, it would have changed the narrative of Bramblewood's history. For some, that truth might have felt like betrayal. Jessica turned her mind to Beatrix, polished, professional, endlessly composed, and deeply invested in the estate's legacy, at least publicly. But Jessica had seen the strain in her eyes after the meeting with the solicitor. The way her hand trembled, just slightly, as she poured tea. Then there was Celia, emotionally fragile, uncertain, perhaps lost in her own shame. And Andrew, motivated by money, yes, but not the kind of man who could kill to keep a family secret. No, the motive lay not in greed, but in something far more volatile. Reputation, inheritance of image. The idea that someone might destroy the version of Bramblewood that had always been told, neatly, safely, without contradiction, was perhaps more threatening than any financial loss. Jessica closed her notebook with a soft sigh. The story was nearly whole now, but someone, still, was trying to tear out the last page. And Jessica had no intention of letting them. The gallery had emptied again, leaving only dust motes suspended in soft evening light. Jessica lingered in front of the restored painting, her thoughts still circling the delicate embrace captured in oil. It wasn't just affection the artist had rendered, it was intimacy, kept quiet, preserved in brushstroke, the kind of love the world once insisted be buried beneath politeness and protocol. Jessica leaned in again, her eyes drawn to the lower right corner. There, just above the frame's inner edge, she noticed something curious, a faint shimmer, not of paint, but of something scratched lightly into the surface beneath the final layer of varnish. She squinted, adjusting her angle. The inscription was nearly invisible unless the light struck just so. A jamais, G forever, G French, etched in delicate script with the tip of something fine, perhaps the end of a brush or even a fingernail. Jessica exhaled softly. The sentiment was quiet, almost mournful. It wasn't a title, it wasn't a label, it was a promise, a dedication. She stepped back. Whoever had painted this had done so not for recognition but remembrance, not for the world, but for one person alone. It was a message not meant for a museum. It was meant for someone who understood. Jessica's thoughts drifted again to the scratched-out face in the photograph, to the burned letter, to the name Harriet, returning again and again. The secret Gwendolen had guarded wasn't just personal, it was sacred, and someone, now, was willing to kill to ensure it stayed that way. The next morning, Jessica ventured into the village. Bramblewood's stone lanes gave way to a quiet square where a single bookshop, a cafe, and the town record office formed a neat triangle of slow, dependable life. Inside the records building, time moved at its own pace, wooden drawers lined with cream folders, the scent of paper older than memory. Jessica asked for records from the 1950s, specifically those relating to Bramblewood Hall. The clerk, a pale woman with an encyclopedic memory and a fondness for local legend, retrieved a slim folder titled Delmont H. "I remember that name," the woman said, her voice low. "She was the housekeeper's daughter, I think, or a cousin," no one quite said. Jessica opened the file. Harriet Delmont, born 1935, worked at Bramblewood briefly as a companion to Gwendolen Brackenridge. No employment record past 1960, no forwarding address, no marriage license, no death certificate. Only one note in faded ink. Left post unexpectedly. No notice given. Jessica's finger hovered over the line. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Was there any gossip?" she asked gently. "Anything not in the records?" The clerk hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if secrets might still echo in the corners. People said she ran off, with someone. But there were whispers. About Gwendolen. About her father being furious. Jessica closed the folder slowly. Furious. That single word brought everything into focus, not just the secret, but the force that had pushed it underground. If Harriet had disappeared because of love, and if Gwendolen had protected her at great personal cost, then the events of the past were not just history, they were motive. Someone had always known. Someone still had something to lose if it came out. And Jessica was getting very close to uncovering it. Afternoon light spilled across the garden as Jessica stepped carefully between the hedges. The sundial stood as it always had, weathered, silent, ignored. But she had learned by now that stillness could be misleading. The chipped edge she'd noticed days before now seemed deliberate. She knelt beside the base, brushing away the damp moss and bits of broken stone. Her fingers found a faint groove, a seam running around the base like a lid. It took time and care, but eventually the heavy disc shifted, groaning slightly as she tilted it aside. Beneath it, a shallow metal box lay tucked in the earth. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside, a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Their edges were fragile with age, but the ink remained sharp. Jessica pulled one free. The handwriting was unmistakably Gwendolen's. "My dearest H, I could never speak it aloud, so I must write it here, where the roses used to bloom. I have not forgotten. I will never forget." Each letter was the same, long, yearning, careful in its restraint, but brimming with quiet sorrow. They had been written over the course of decades, each one signed the same way. G. At the bottom of the box was something else, a folded sheet of newer paper, heavier stock. Jessica opened it and found Gwendolyn's writing once more. This time it wasn't a letter, it was a confession. To whom it may concern, I kept Harriet's secret because it was mine too. We were more than friends. My father never forgave me. He forced her away. I brought her back in time, and for a while she lived here, hidden, loved. I never told the truth, but I will now. Bramblewood is hers as much as it is mine. Jessica's hands were steady, but her heart was heavy. There was no shame in the words, only love and pain that had never been given voice. If Gwendolyn had planned to reveal this, even change the will in Harriet's favor, then her death wasn't just about money, it was about silencing a legacy someone feared more than scandal, more than justice. Jessica stood slowly, box in hand. Now she understood the danger Gwendolyn had been in, and perhaps she knew where to look next, for Harriet. Not in the past, but possibly right under their noses all along. Jessica stood in the drawing room, the metal box from the garden resting on the table before her like a quiet monument. Afternoon shadows lengthened across the carpet, drawing long lines that intersected the corners of the room where truth had so often gone unspoken. She read Gwendolyn's confession once more. The writing was calm, deliberate, like everything Gwendolyn had ever done, but threaded with sorrow and resolve. This was not the work of a woman cowed by scandal or shame. It was the voice of someone who had lived too long in silence and, at the end, had chosen to be brave. Jessica closed the lid gently and sat back in the armchair. So many things were suddenly clearer. The painting beneath layers of deception. The sealed letter never sent. The whispered arguments. The safe hidden behind the library shelves. The way Gwendolyn had looked around the table that final night, composed but searching, as though gauging the cost of what she was about to reveal. She had not feared death. She had feared the reaction of those seated closest to her. Jessica's mind returned to Beatrix, elegant, capable, unyielding, a woman who had risen through discipline and refinement, who prized the image of Bramblewood as fiercely as any heir might. But Jessica had also seen the frayed edges, how Beatrix's composure cracked ever so slightly when truth veered too close. The change in the will was more than a financial slight. It was a threat to the house's carefully preserved mythology. And to Beatrix, mythology was currency. If Harriet had been exposed, not as a long-forgotten employee, but as the quiet heart of Gwendolyn's life, it would have altered the legacy Bramblewood presented to the world. Perhaps Beatrix feared the scandal, or perhaps she feared being erased by a version of history she couldn't control. And yet, Jessica could not ignore the other undercurrents. Celia, emotionally fragile, had clearly known something. Her retreat into nervous searching, the key hidden in the compact, it hinted at guilt, but not malice. She had been protecting a story too heavy for her. Andrew's motives, while desperate, were blunt and full of noise. He wanted control. But Jessica had seen him that night, angry, yes, but broken. If he had lashed out, he wouldn't have covered his tracks so neatly. No, Gwendolyn's fall was not impulsive. It had been calculated. Jessica opened her notebook and slowly began to sketch the timeline, who was where, when, and what each had to gain or lose. She underlined one word: fear. Fear, not hatred, had killed Gwendolyn. Not to gain something, but to stop something from being lost. Control, reputation, the story Bramblewood told itself. And so Jessica wrote, beneath the page, what if the secret wasn't buried in the garden, but still alive, somewhere in the house? She sat back, the fire now just embers behind the grate. The final answers were close, but they would not come easily. Truth rarely did. The The drawing room at Bramblewood Hall had not hosted such a gathering since the night Gwendolen died, and though the light from the tall windows still filtered in gently, it now seemed to cast longer, colder shadows across the floor. Jessica stood near the hearth, notebook in hand. The others had gathered slowly, Andrew stiff and guarded, Celia, eyes red-rimmed, Beatrix, composed as ever but rigid in her stance, and Mrs. Elkins, standing behind the settee with folded hands, watchful. "I want to thank you all for coming," Jessica began, her tone quiet but firm. "There's something I need to say, and I believe it concerns everyone in this room." No one spoke. Andrew shifted, crossing his arms. Celia picked nervously at her sleeve. Jessica continued, "When Gwendolen invited me to Bramblewood, I believed I was coming for a reunion. But what I walked into was something far more complex, a house filled with loyalty, silence, and a legacy shaped not only by history, but by the people left out of it." She glanced toward the portrait over the mantel, the one Miles had begun to restore, now half revealed. Two women, quietly side by side, their story long obscured. Jessica let the silence stretch before speaking again. "I know about the painting. I know about the letters buried beneath the sundial, and I know about the hidden safe in the library, one Gwendolen opened the night she died." Beatrix's posture stiffened, and Andrew's brow furrowed. Jessica met each gaze steadily. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was one of fear. Someone here believed that if Gwendolen revealed the truth about her past, about Harriet, it would change everything. She paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle. But sometimes what we bury out of shame is exactly what must be brought to light. The room remained silent, but Jessica could feel the air beginning to shift. The truth was no longer hidden. Now it only had to be spoken. Jessica's voice remained gentle, but there was clarity behind each word now, like morning fog lifting just enough to reveal the outline of something long obscured. "Gwendolen did not simply fall," she said. "The staircase rug had been tampered with, tucked under just enough to catch a heel. It was a subtle act, but a deliberate one, and when she fell, she landed with something in her hand." Jessica opened her notebook and tapped the page where she had sketched the bracelet. She clutched an old bracelet, not hers, perhaps torn free during a struggle, or perhaps taken as a final message. She knew what was coming, or at least sensed it. Celia let out a soft breath. Beatrix remained unmoved. "Then there was the porcelain figurine shattered on the landing," Jessica added. "It had stood there for years, until that night. It wasn't knocked off by chance. It had been placed to fall, to mask the sound, to create the illusion of a stumble." Andrew looked down at the floor, as though reliving each detail now with new meaning. Jessica continued, "But what struck me most was the timing. Gwendolen had planned to make an announcement. She had met with a solicitor, she had begun writing her memoirs, she even reopened the safe, the same one where she'd once hidden letters and perhaps the revised will. She turned to Beatrix. "You knew what was in that safe, didn't you?" Beatrix's lips parted, but she said nothing. Jessica softened her voice. "You believed Gwendolen's decision would unravel everything you'd preserved, that the Bramblewood you helped manage and defend would be rewritten by a truth you couldn't control." Still silence. Gwendolen's death was staged to look like an accident, but everything about it, every detail, spoke not of malice, but fear, a fear more powerful than greed. Jessica paused, allowing the implications to sink in. Not anger, not rage, but the quiet, suffocating terror of a truth coming into daylight, a truth with a name. And as Jessica looked toward Mrs. Elkins, she saw the flicker, brief, almost imperceptible, of someone who knew more than she had ever let on. Jessica turned her gaze fully to Mrs. Elkins, whose expression was composed but unreadable. A lifetime of silence had trained her face well. But there was a stillness to her now, like someone at the edge of a decision. "Mrs. Elkins," Jessica said gently. "You knew Harriet Delmont." The older woman said nothing. Jessica took a step forward. "You were with Gwendolen in the early years, not just as a housekeeper or a companion, but as something more." Celia's eyes widened slightly. Andrew looked confused. Beatrix didn't move. Jessica reached into her satchel and removed a folded letter, one from the box beneath the sundial. She opened it slowly. "This was written in 1962, she said. "Addressed to my dearest H. It speaks of hiding, of exile, of love refused permission, and it's signed, as all the letters were, G." Jessica placed the letter on the nearby table and looked again at the woman standing quietly behind the settee. "You didn't vanish, Harriet. You never left. You changed your name. And Gwendolen gave you the only protection she could, an anonymous place in her life." The silence in the room thickened. Mrs. Elkins drew in a breath. Her eyes, now moist, met Jessica's for the first time with something unguarded. "She begged me to stay," she said, her voice low, worn thin by memory. "After her father forced me out, she brought me back. Secretly. Said the world didn't need to know, only that I was safe." She swallowed hard. "I took her name. Elkins was her mother's family name. I stayed here as a shadow. And she never stopped writing me letters, even after we shared the same house again." Celia whispered, "But why stay hidden?" Harriet looked at her. "Because Gwendolen knew it would destroy the estate. Her father made that clear, and she loved this place almost as much as she loved me." Jessica's heart ached, not for tragedy, but for endurance. "And now," Jessica said softly, "someone feared you might be revealed." Harriet nodded once, a motion barely perceptible. Jessica didn't press her further. There was no need. The truth, long suppressed, had risen, quietly, calmly, and in the voice of someone who had survived the cost of silence. But there was still one truth left to face, and Jessica knew exactly who that final question belonged to. Jessica's voice remained calm, but her gaze was unwavering as she turned toward Beatrix. "You knew who she was," she said softly. "Didn't you?" Beatrix's lips barely parted. Her eyes flickered just once toward Mrs. Elkins, Harriet, and then away again, as though the truth, now visible, was too sharp to look at directly. Jessica continued. "You were fiercely loyal to Bramblewood. You kept its records, protected its image. When the estate began declining, you introduced tours, hosted fundraisers, even advised Gwendolen on her memoir. You did everything to preserve this house and its story." There was no accusation in her tone, only understanding. But Gwendolen was going to change that. She wasn't just planning to update the will, she was preparing to tell the truth about Harriet, about what Bramblewood had hidden for decades. Jessica stepped forward, slow and steady. She took the bracelet from the box in the safe that night, a keepsake. Maybe the last piece of the past she still kept close. "You followed her into the hallway after dinner. You pleaded." But Gwendolen was resolute. Celia let out a quiet gasp. Andrew said nothing. Jessica's voice grew even softer. It wasn't premeditated, it was fear. She turned her back, and you, perhaps just meaning to stop her, reached for her. There was a struggle, a twist. The rug gave way. Beatrix didn't speak. Jessica pressed gently. "But then you placed the figurine. You didn't run. You made it look like an accident, because you still wanted to protect the house, even after everything." The silence hung for a moment like mist after rain. Then Beatrix spoke, her voice hoarse. "I begged her not to do it," she whispered. "The donors, the family legacy, it would have unraveled everything. Bramblewood would have become a scandal, a headline. She said that was the point, that truth mattered more than comfort." Beatrix's jaw trembled. "I didn't want to hurt her. I only grabbed her arm, but she slipped. and when I saw what had happened, I couldn't undo it." Jessica's heart was heavy, not with judgment, but with sorrow. "You loved her too," she said. Beatrix nodded once. "But differently," she said. "Never the way Harriet did. I was just what was left when history is done being written." Beatrix sat slowly on the edge of the settee, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if by holding herself still she might keep the moment from collapsing. "I thought I was preserving something sacred," she murmured, "but all I was doing was protecting a lie." No one moved. No one interrupted. Jessica sat opposite her, the box of letters still resting between them, fragile as breath. "There's no part of me," Beatrix continued, "that doesn't regret what I did. It was instinct, not malice, but that doesn't make it less true." Jessica offered a gentle nod. "Intentions don't erase consequences." Harriet stepped forward, her voice soft but unwavering. "She was ready to set things right, Beatrix, not for herself, for all of us. You didn't need to stop her." Beatrix blinked, tears caught just behind her eyes. "I didn't think there'd be any forgiveness left," she whispered. Harriet gave a faint, weary smile. "Forgiveness isn't a favor, it's just another kind of truth." Beatrix looked to Jessica. "What happens now?" Jessica didn't raise her voice. "You'll speak with Inspector Barrow. Honestly, this time. I believe the court will understand what happened. But it isn't the law that weighs most, Beatrix. It's the legacy of silence you tried to uphold." Jessica stood slowly. The weight of the house, the weight of its secrets, felt lighter now, but not gone. Harriet turned toward the window, gazing out across the gardens, where ivy still curled around the stone sundial. The truth had come, not with shouts, but in the quiet voices of women who had waited too long to be heard. And it had not destroyed Bramblewood, it had freed it. The ivy on the outer walls of Bramblewood swayed gently in the morning breeze, like a breath the old house had been holding finally released. With the formalities behind them, statements given, the truth laid bare, Jessica moved quietly through the corridors, alone now, but for the echo of memory. She paused at the bottom of the great staircase where Gwendolen had fallen. The rug had been straightened, the figurine replaced. But the space still felt fragile, touched by something that lingered beyond dust or time. It wasn't guilt that hung in the air. It was absence. In the upstairs hallway, the light streamed through lace curtains in long, slanted beams. Jessica rested her fingers briefly on the cracked mirror she had first noticed days ago. The fracture remained, clean and slender, like a truth too long resisted. But now it didn't feel like a flaw. It felt honest. She stepped into Gwendolen's study, untouched since the final evening. A notebook still sat on the desk, the pen lying beside it as if it might be picked up again at any moment. Jessica moved toward the shelves where the family portraits stood. She studied the one of Gwendolen as a young woman. Elegant, distant, but beneath the formal frame, something almost defiant in her gaze. Jessica smiled. "She kept so much hidden," she murmured, "and yet she still found a way to tell the truth." Outside the window, the sundial in the garden caught the early sun. The ivy was climbing its stone base again, quiet, persistent, unapologetic, just as love had been. Jessica turned from the study, her steps soft as she walked the length of the corridor one last time. A house like this didn't forget. It merely waited until someone came along willing to listen. They sat in the small garden room overlooking the orchard. The tea was steeped from a familiar porcelain pot, and Harriet, no longer Mrs. Elkins, at least not today, poured with the same steady grace she had shown as housekeeper. Only now her eyes met Jessica's with clarity, not caution. "Will you stay on?" Jessica asked gently. Harriet gave a small smile. "Number, it wouldn't be right. Gwendolen always said Bramblewood should reflect the truth, not just tradition. I think, now that it's finally spoken, my place here is finished." Jessica nodded. Do you have somewhere to go? I have enough, Harriet said. She made sure of it. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't press for answers. The orchard beyond was blooming faintly, the branches humming with quiet birdsong, a spring barely begun. I spent so long hiding in plain sight, Harriet said softly. I started to believe that version of me was the only one who could exist. But Gwendolen? She never stopped writing to the real me, even when we stopped using our names. Jessica folded her hands in her lap. She gave you love when the world wasn't ready for it, and you gave her the same. Harriet looked down at her cup. Do you think that's enough? Jessica hesitated. It has to be. It's more than most people ever find. They didn't speak again after that, not for several minutes, but in that quiet something shifted, like a page finally turned, not to forget what had come before, but to allow the next lines to begin. As the tea cooled between them, Jessica reached into her bag, her fingers brushing the edge of her own notebook. Not every confession required ink. Some simply required witness. Back in her room, Jessica opened her notebook, the pages already softened from days of observation and thought. She uncapped her pen and began to write, not for the authorities, not for publication, but for herself. Some legacies live in buildings, others in bloodlines. But the quietest, and perhaps the strongest, live in secrets shared between two people, too fragile to survive daylight, yet too strong to ever truly disappear. She paused, thinking of Gwendolen and Harriet. How they had endured in the same house, unseen and unspoken, how they had built something real within walls that demanded silence. And how, in the end, truth had chosen its own way out, through letters, through art, through the woman who had finally stopped being invisible. Jessica turned to a new page and drew 3 small symbols across the top margin, a bracelet, a broken mirror, and a sundial. 3 quiet clues, 3 fragments of a life deferred, but not denied. What struck Jessica most wasn't the deception, but the endurance, the quiet courage of love that asked for nothing, only space to exist. And the damage done by those who thought history was theirs to shape. She remembered Beatrix's face in that final moment, not hateful, not vindictive, just terrified. Terrified that the story she had helped shape would be rewritten by a truth she hadn't written. The truth, when it finally arrives, Jessica wrote, doesn't shout, it lingers, in letters, in portraits, in ivy, it waits to be seen. She closed the notebook and let it rest on the desk. Some stories didn't require a final paragraph. They required understanding. Jessica stood at the threshold of the garden path, her suitcase beside her. The morning was cool, the scent of rain lingering faintly in the breeze. She glanced back at the house one final time, its windows tall and still, its ivy reaching ever upward. Was justice served, she wondered quietly, or simply delayed by love, fear, and the weight of silence? She didn't pretend to have the answer. Beatrix would face the consequences, Harriet would leave, Bramblewood would in time become part of the world again, no longer sealed by secrecy but changed by it. Some truths didn't ask for justice, they asked for air. Jessica picked up her bag and stepped through the gate, but the question lingered, quietly, insistently, as questions always did. And now, dear listener, you've walked the ivy-lined halls with me, followed the scent of lavender and the sound of secrets rustling just behind closed doors. What do you think? Was the truth too long buried? Would you have forgiven as Harriet did? Or turned away like Beatrix, desperate to preserve the past? Tell me in the comments your thoughts, your questions, your truths. And if this quiet mystery stirred something in you, share it with someone who loves a story whispered rather than shouted. Someone who understands that the sharpest clues are often found in broken mirrors and old ink. There are always more mysteries to uncover. So stay curious, and until the next one, take care of the stories we keep, and even more, the ones we dare to tell. Some truths once unearthed do not shatter the past, They simply ask to be carried gently into the present. But tell me, was justice truly served, or did silence win again in a quieter form? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you believe really happened that night? Share your theory in the comments. And if you enjoyed walking these ivy-lined paths with me, do give this story a like, pass it along to a fellow mystery lover, and subscribe to stay close by for the next whisper of intrigue.